Hey everyone, we're getting ready to get started here in about a minute. Join our training this evening on how to examine your supply chain for resilience. How you doing, Howard?
Good, good. How you doing, Randy?
Good. Howard's my co-host this evening, and we're going to present information on basically helping you understand what and how to find resilience in your supply chain, kind of what to look for, how to look at things, how to evaluate your vendors to make sure you're selecting the best vendors. Those are the things we'll be talking about tonight. And we want to make sure we give you practical, actionable information in the shortest amount of time possible so that you can get what you need. All right. We got more folks joining us. About another minute or so, let more people join us. Coming on in. There we go. Welcome, Charles. Appreciate you joining us this evening. Thank you very much. All right, it is the top of the hour. We do not want to punish the punctual. Thank you for joining us. So this evening, we're going to talk about how to examine the supply chain for resilience. My co-host, Howard, is going to help us understand how to use supply chain resilience to find more strength in your supply chain so you find opportunities by being faster than your competition. Next slide. So as we can see in the news now, there's headlines all about resilience. Forbes, MIT News, Harvard Business Review, everyone's talking about resilience. And I want to note here is Harvard Business Review is seeing how small business is playing a key role in resilience. Why? Because they're the folks that are going to respond most favorably to you when you need them most, because they're small businesses and they want to grow. Howard, what are your thoughts on using small businesses in a big supply chain?
I think it's important. I think it's great for the economy. It also gives you different forms of resilience because different smaller companies can be good at certain things. So it definitely helps within the resilience part. And it's great to also support small business, support your local economy.
And that's also important for resilience because you want that economy to be strong so that it's there for you when you need it. If it's, if you're trying to grow a local footprint, kind of like during COVID, having a supplier across country wasn't always a good thing because you had transportation. That can be definitely helpful. Next slide, please. So what we did, surveys on LinkedIn. Did it advance over? There we go. Perfect. And when we did, we asked the question is, why do people rationalize vendors? What are they looking for in the supply chain? And what I found interesting was the tie between reduce cost and mitigate or improve quality. Nobody talked about resilience, or resilience was kind of the lowest thing people talked about, and then mitigating risk was something else. So when they're rationalizing their vendors, meaning they're narrowing their supply base down to a few key suppliers that are most important and most able to serve them, they're focused on cost and quality. It has nothing to do with risk or resilience. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it does make sense. Well, for example, for us, right, rationalizing your vendors, making sure that you have the right amount, it does make sense, especially, like in my industry, for example, in aerospace manufacturing, having too many vendors, for example, having 8 vendors trying to make one part, it costs a lot of money trying to maintain that. And it costs, you can be really resilient, but yet costs a lot to manage 7, 8 people. It's a lot better to maybe go down to 3 or 2 vendors, may have them make it and have the best quality because you're taking the time to manage with them, taking the time to make sure that they're making the product correctly and stuff like that. Because it does take time and effort. What do you think, Randy?
Yeah, time and effort, getting down to, even though you're reducing for cost and quality, you're also increasing resilience because better quality, more effective cost, and then building a stronger strategic relationship with those vendors help you maintain a stronger supply chain that you can rely on versus one that has, you're going for the lowest cost. Then you're right there. You're looking for lowest cost, which means vendors, as we found out during COVID, were falling out because they couldn't withstand a crisis themselves. And then the other survey was, what's the most important factor when you're actually selecting your vendors? And the number one was define strategy. Define strategy really helped focus people's efforts. And, I wasn't surprised. I was kind of hoping, but I didn't want to speak for the survey because it makes sense. Define strategy. If my strategy is resilience, then I'm going to choose different vendors versus when my strategy is reduce cost. If you can find a balance, which we're going to talk about tonight, is how to find that zone of balance where you're leveraging or you're balancing cost and resilience at the same time. Next slide, please. So just a quick highlight, we've had 2 other webinars, and we have another webinar coming up in January and February. Previous webinars were analysis of the supply chain intelligence, which we talked about the 8 criteria of supply chain intelligence, which we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. In other words, what are you evaluating resilience for? And then the 5 steps for mapping your supply chain. What are the steps we're going to use to take those criteria and start to find where you have weaks, gaps, and strengths within your supply chain? Next slide, please. So Howard, this is where, you talked about this in our last webinar in more detail, but we want to kind of review that before we move on, and how to rationalize your vendors. Actually rationalize, or, how do you evaluate different vendors using the matrix that you talked about in the webinar, 5 steps to mapping your supply chain. So why don't you go ahead and take it over and let us know what your thoughts are.
Cool. Thanks, Randy. Yeah, so here's the part we were talking about last webinar in our 5 steps to mapping your supply chain. If you haven't had a chance to watch this video on our webinar, go back. It's the second one in our series, 5 steps to mapping your supply chain. The link is found here if you want to go back and watch it. For those of you who have watched it and just need a quick refresher, we'll go ahead and talk about it real quick. So this is the decision matrix, where you, in a specific example, we're looking at 3 specific categories that we're analyzing each supply chain for. So supply chain 1, 2, and 3. And we're looking in this specific example at political, infrastructure, and quality. As you remember from the last webinar, you're rating it a scale of 1 through 5, 5 being the most resilient, 1 being the least resilient. Then you also add a weight for which relates to the amount of importance for that specific portion. For example, so if infrastructure was really important, you'd give it a weight of 5. So in this specific example, we're saying that everything is important. You look at here, you put in your score, and you multiply out the weight, which gives you your score, right? So 5, score 5 times 5 is 20, score 1, what's wrong with 5? And you do that all the way along. Yeah. At least this math is a little wrong, but this one is right here. 5 times 20. So in this specific example, again, the score of 60 is the highest, means that it is the highest in resilience. It's the most favorable. 50, so supply chain 2 is the second most favorable, and supply chain 3 is the least favorable. Again, go back to the last webinar where we actually did the math correctly, right, Randy?
Yeah, we hope so. Well, I think the point here is that we're just illustrating that there's a score, right? We were able to use these different areas, a weighted score average and a matrix, to find out a score and separate vendors from themselves based on the criteria we've set up. So
yeah, and use different factors. Yep, use different factors in order to make an overall score. So you can take these 3 examples and make an overall score, so you can take into account everything. So here's the next thing, right? So we're going to talk about balancing resilience with cost, because there is cost, investment. So cost and time. You have to invest time and cost in order to get a certain amount of resilience. But in actuality, in the supply chain, you can have too much resilience or too little resilience. So before we go on to the next slide with the charts, and it shows you how this goes, I wanted to use this analogy for you so that you can easily understand what we're talking about. So last January in 2021, me and my fiance here. So this is me. This is my fiance. We were going outdoor backpacking or backpacking camping, which is different from when you go car camping. Here, as you can see, when you go backpacking, and this was in Sequoia National Forest, you need to bring everything that you're going to survive on. You don't just go in your car. You can't just go to the store and go buy some more food if you run out of it, more fuel. If you're cold, go grab a jacket. Everything that you bring within these 2 backpacks, which these 2 arrows are showing, is all you're allowed to bring. So this really for resilience wise, this is really important to understand, just like with your supply chain, because there's only a limit to the amount of food that you can bring, to an amount of equipment that you can bring, and then also to consider the weight. So as you go through, as we were going through this, and we're about to go camping, right? In January, still in California, up in the mountains where it's about 10,000 feet, 11,000 feet, it's still going to be cold. And we went 15 miles. So for this example, right, we need to take into account the fact that we're going to go on a long hike and camp somewhere in the middle of the wilderness, that it's going to be in the 20s and 30s. So I need to make sure that I bring the right equipment. And then also need to make sure I bring enough water and food. So when you consider this, right, just like with anything else in the supply chain, if you're going on a long journey, that means you can't bring as much extra, like maybe backpacking chairs or anything that makes you more comfortable. You have to worry about the things that matter to make sure you have just the right amount of water, the right amount of food, and you're bringing the right equipment, that you're investing in good equipment, that you're investing in the things that you need, because there's a limit to how much you can bring. What's your thoughts, Randy?
I think when you talked about cold weather and being a backpacker myself, like a sleeping bag is prime example. A cold weather sleeping bag is going to keep you warm when it's in the 20s or lower, but those are more expensive, right? Or if you get a cheaper cold weather sleeping bag, it's going to weigh a lot, which is going to limit how much food you can carry in your backpack. So, I mean, this is a great example of resilience, because you're leaving everything behind and you're going off into the wilderness to have a hike and enjoy yourself. But if you forget something, you're going to pay a price. And
or if you bring too much, right?
Bring too much, yeah, then you're carrying too much on your back, and you can't go as far, or you can't hike as long. And I've experienced that a couple times when I was starting to backpack. And that's a great example I had during COVID. My son and I, we went hiking to the Smokies, and we had 10 days worth of food. And my son was a little bit smaller, than he couldn't carry as much as I could carry, but he was carrying a lot of weight, more weight than he could carry. Because in backpacking, you can carry about 30% of your body weight. So if you're about 200 pounds like me, you can carry about 60 pounds. 30% of 150 pounds, is about 45 pounds, and that's if you're in shape and you're used to backpacking. If you're not, it's even less. And we had to basically get 2 days into a hike, and we had to bail early because we just couldn't go much further. Couldn't handle the weight. We couldn't shed the stuff because we're in the wilderness. You can just drop it. We had to carry it. So this is a great example of illustrating resilience, because you have to make choices, cost choices, because you may only have so much budget. You can't buy the super expensive, super cold sleeping bag, as well as weight choices. How much can you actually carry? So yeah, I think that's a good, very good example.
Yeah, which impacts where you can go and all that. So keep this in mind. And here is the next slide. So this is another important concept that we wanted to show you all today, because this is called the zone, or the balance flexibility, balance resilience. So going back to that, right? Referring back to that backpacking example, all the green here is essentially what your backpack can carry, the amount of food, the amount of equipment, all the stuff that you can be to be resilient without having too much stuff, then you can't go as far, or having too little stuff and now you're miserable. So this is a good example here. So on the x-axis here is investment. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the amount of investment that you have, comparing that to the amount of resilience that you have. Here's the y-axis and x-axis as labeled here. So as you increase the amount of investment and the amount of money, you will continue to go up this way into the balance flexibility. If you invest too much time and too much money, and you're not getting the amount of resilience that you need, can easily go into this area here, reduce the risk. So what we want to do is make sure that we have the right amount of investment, so minimize loss of profits, but also still have the reduced risk. So you really want to find that sweet spot. Randy, got anything for that?
Yeah, and this is a great chart to illustrate the difference and how you need to find that balance. As I say, for example, you have a score that puts you over in this area right here, where you have a loss. You have too much. You're spending too much money, but you're not getting the resilience you need. Maybe you can back off the cost and put you in this balance to where you get into your budget and get the resilience you need. Right. And same thing over here. If you're not spending enough, and you have a lot of resilience, which sometimes that's good, but as you say, you may not be good. So you can lower that and maybe reduce your costs even more. So you're looking for that balance right there. I think a good chart and way it shows how to illustrate this. So yeah,
Yeah.
very good.
And so another thing with this too, what this chart allows you to do is it gives you a good visual representation of where the suppliers in your supply chain are. So going back to the example, right? So say this is right here, just an example, that's a dot for a certain supplier. You're spending all this money on this supplier, you're spending a lot of time with them, making sure they're up to date, that they're able to produce what you want at the right time, but yet it's taking too much investment. Then it would indicate somewhere like, for example, here in the loss of profits area, right? The moment that you decrease investment or increase resilience, it'll slowly start going back into here, into the zone of balance flexibility. And if you're wondering how to exactly chart this out and do all that, we're going to talk this more in greater detail when we have our class next year, which we're going to announce. So this is just a good example to show you, and it's giving you the overall concept, right? And going back here, right, you use your score and you're plotting it here. So then here's another good example. If you say, right, now you have too much risk, too much resilience. Yeah, you're spending too much time and not enough resilience, then it can come up here, right? Because now you have too much, you're spending too much time, and you can bring it back down in where it's a lot more flexible, where it makes more sense. So there's always a give and take, right? You can spend too much time on your supply chain, too much money, and you're not getting the amount of resilience, or you can even be getting too much resilience to the amount of money that you're getting in, because you always want to have it balanced. You can also have what is called the law of diminishing returns, right? Where the amount of effort that you're putting into something and the amount of return that you're getting, just like a return on investment. You want to make sure that it's always in that sweet spot where it's beneficial for you and your supply chain. You got anything else, Randy?
Yeah, we're definitely describing how to find that balance. Because like using that sleeping bag, for example, you can go to get a Coleman sleeping bag for sub-zero, and it's going to give you a lot of resilience, but you're going to pay a price in weight and
Cost
weight
and
and
everything.
cost, and as well as in there. So you want to start to slowly move it this way. You may have to spend more money to get a more balanced resilience. You got to spend more money to get something that's going to keep you warm but not cost too much weight. So I think it highlights a very good point of investments, not only are money, but also time, effort, weight. Other things can affect your resilience as well. So there's other costs that you have to look at, but it's finding the balance. And every supply chain is different. Every supplier is different. And that's why you look at the 8 factors we talked about in the elements of supply chain intelligence, as well as how to use that in a matrix to get a score to kind of give you an idea. So when you plot it, different vendors and different suppliers, you kind of see where it all kind of hangs out and find your zone of resilience for that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Goes back here. Cool. Next slide. There you go,
Excellent.
Randy.
And then once you find your zone of resilience, then you want to take that information and rationalize your suppliers. Meaning, you look at all your suppliers. You say you have 80 suppliers that can do one particular item. That's a lot of suppliers. You want to narrow that down to 3 or 4 or 5 so that you can spend more time with those 3 or 4 or 5 to increase resilience with them. Trying to manage 80 vendors. Trying to keep too many going is a investment or waste of time and effort trying to manage them. So first you want to do is define your strategy, which we saw in our survey was what everyone else thought. That's the key to good resilience. And then you identify your criteria that we talked about in the 8 elements of supply chain. So with the data, you're better able to know what things you want to measure. Then you evaluate the potential of each vendor. Just like a battery has potential, you want to make sure that potential power in the battery is small. You want to look at your vendors and see what their potential is. And
Hey,
then you're going to
Randy,
assess.
this all sounds, Randy, sorry to interrupt, but this all sounds good and it sounds technical. What exactly is rationalization of your supply chain?
Oh, rationalization is when you look at all your vendors, and that's where you're picking which ones are the best ones. So what you do is you assess your vendors, say you have 5, you score them for resilience, and then the top 3 balance out. They're the ones the top. So what you end up doing is keep the top 3 and you let go of the other 2. And so that's when you're rationalizing or selecting the best vendors. You're rationalizing it against your strategy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
We're rationalizing against our strategy, and then we're going to assess their strategic value. We're going to use the Kraljic matrix, which looks at the routine, bottleneck, strategic, or leverage suppliers and where they fall into that Kraljic matrix quadrant. Then we're going to assess that strategic value, and the more strategic vendors that give you that long-term investment, we're going to keep, and we're going to select those vendors. But that's going to depend upon our strategy, which is the very first step that we have to define. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, that's why, when we do these webinars, try and keep them short, sweet, right to the point. And what we did tonight was we described what resilience is, finding that balance, and then giving you the 5 steps you need to rationalize your vendors inside your supply chain. Next slide.
Hey, Ryan, I'd like to go back to one thing real quick, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so going back to this, guys, just so we can hit this point home, right? We were talking about rationalizing your supply base. That also impacts this, right? Your total balance of flexibility or balance resilience. Because if you have, say, like I was saying before, 8 or 9 vendors to make one part, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment to manage that many suppliers. And you may not need that many, right? You may only need 3, which will bring you back over into your balance of flexibility, right? Or if you have too little, then you're now in too much risk. So you want to make sure that you're always balanced, that you have maybe 3 or 4 vendors rather than the 8 you need. And of course, it's all dependent on your individual supply chain needs, but this concept is always the same, that you make sure that you have just what you need in the right place, in the right time, the right vendors, the right resilience, because everything in supply chain is a balancing act. And, there's different methods that you can use to do it, right? And it goes back to this with the backpacking trip, right? Go back to the balance flexibility. Anything else, Randy, on that?
That's great to drive that point home. Hopefully the backpacking example helps illustrate how to see how balance works, so that's important to do that. And we come into January 26th. Next month, we're going to talk about how to build an emergency operations center so that you can manage different situations. So you're set up with proper structure, you know how to manage the flow of information and actually make decisions. So we did have a question. We had a question. Is there a rule of thumb for the number of vendors? Wondering how you know when you have too many. Great question, Richard. And when you know you have too many is when you're taking way too much time to manage those. And the best way to look at that is when we use that Kraljic matrix. You may not be familiar with it. Is that you start with routine is in that lower quadrant where it's something that we have a lot of suppliers and they can easily be replaced. Think of office supplies as routine. And then you have a leveraged supplier, someone where you try to leverage economies of scale, where you try to get, say, a lot of value from them by using financing strategies, other leveraging strategies.
Price breaks, yeah.
Price breaks. Or you may have a bottleneck item, something that's not very expensive, but is crucial for operations. That if you don't have it, then, it's going to shut down everything. And then you have those strategic suppliers who are with you for the long term. They're kind of a joint venture. They're what you would call a partner in the long term for what you're trying to do, so that you end up having strategic value. So, your strategic partners, long-term partners, you're going to want maybe 2 or 3 type like that. Routine, you're going to, as easy as you can use them. You use reverse auctions, you go to online, Amazon, plenty of suppliers, all kinds of different things to do it. So it really kind of depends upon the where they fall in on that Kraljic matrix. That is going to determine how many vendors you want. Something in the bottleneck, you would want to think of something that has a proprietary advantage. They have a patent or a trademark or something that only that person can use, that specific thing. So you have to go with that person. So you have to use a different strategy for them as well. So yeah, very good. Very good. Great question. I appreciate that. All right. So just to kind of wrap it up, on January 26th, we are going to do another webinar. So you can definitely go over there now and register for that webinar. And that way you'll be able to get notifications just like this one. And just go to supplychainmanagement.jobs, SCM, how to build supply chain response. You'll see there when you go to free resources training, you'll see it right there. You can click there and go ahead and register for the next webinar we're going to have in January. So Howard, any last thoughts?
Yeah. So just to remind everybody, right, this is now the third webinar of our 5 webinar series. As you notice, we're going through each point. We're hitting the high points. We're hitting right how to analyze the supply chain, how to map it out, how to look for certain criteria, how to grade it, and then how to balance it. So we're slowly going through all these different steps to show you how to make your supply chain more resilient using an actual process that will make sure that you get to the amount of resilience that you need. The next episode or next webinar, as we're saying here, January 26th, about the Emergency Operations Center. We're using all of this intelligence, all of the information that we gathered from the supply chain. And now we're going to actually start putting into a plan and also start getting teams together so that when it's time for when an emergency comes up, we're able to react quickly, already be proactive about it and understand that there's an emergency coming. Just like in the military, we have a lot of battalion staff that works with, the different types of commanders in order to get information and to make informed, quick decisions. And that's the important part of this.
Too much, Howard. They got to come in January. They got to find out all that. We don't want to give away the webinar too early. So definitely we'll see you guys on the 26th. Have a wonderful evening. Enjoy your holidays, and we'll see you next year.
Cool.
Bye-bye.